All right. So let's talk about evolution. Ooh. Now, when I talk about evolution, I get more angry comments about that than anything. And part of it is because nobody likes to hear an argument that makes their team look wrong. So you'll get hatred if you have a reasonable argument about why the other side was wrong. And let me tell you something, I don't know if I've ever admitted this, but I'm going to admit it for the first time. When I wrote my book, The Dilbert Future, I think it was 1997, it came out, and I had a number of predictions. And I put one prediction in there that I knew would be controversial. I did not know how controversial it would be. And just as I was saying, that nearly 100% of the disagreement is disagreement and angry disagreement with a misperception of what I said. So for however many years this has been going on since I wrote that book, people have been so mad at me for things I don't believe and did not say. But they think they understand it and they're mad at it. But what I predicted was that the theory of evolution, which I consider a scientific fact, and when I say it's a scientific fact, I mean that within the rules of science, as science has described its own domain, it calls a theory that has so much evidence for it a fact. So in science, a theory doesn't mean something that might be true and might not be. In science, the word theory means that it has already passed all of the checks and balances so that within the theory of science, it could be called a fact. So when I say evolution is a scientific fact, I mean that internal to the way science works and how they use words, the word fact fits their own definition of what a fact is and what a theory is. So I accept that the scientific consensus is what science says. That is different from being true. Something can be a scientific theory with so much evidence that for all practical purposes, scientists call it a fact. But because they call it that, and because it has lots of evidence, is slightly different from whether it's true. Something could be false and have plenty of evidence that maybe later they'll find out wasn't good evidence. But at the moment, it's considered true within the theory of science. Okay? I said, my prediction, 1997-ish, that scientists would debunk evolution in my lifetime. Now let me tell you why I made that prediction. I made it, and this is the part I've never really said in public. That was a dartboard prediction. I simply took the least likely thing that would be debunked and then said it would be. So my entire process here was, I said, what is the least likely thing that science will ever say, oh, we were wrong, we got that wrong? The least likely thing. And I thought, probably evolution. And so I made a prediction that the least likely thing, the thing that has the most evidence for it, I mean, tremendous amount of evidence, I said that the most certain thing in my lifetime will be shown to be false. Now, you can imagine how much criticism I got from that. People stopped reading Dilbert. I was just lampooned and, completely just destroyed in various skeptic magazines, etc. And then I waited. Now, I knew that would be controversial, but I figured I'll just wait. And the thinking behind it was that pretty much everything you're positive about in science will probably be wrong in the future. So when people say, why did you pick on evolution? It was because it was so unlikely to be debunked. That's why I said it was be debunked, because it would be the best example of this concept. The concept being that everything you think is true probably isn't. The things that are true are the things that you could test and say, all right, if I let go of this ball, I believe that gravity is true and the ball will fall, and then you let go of it and it falls. Evolution is one of those things where it's true and it passes the tests of science, but mostly you're looking backwards. It's hard to evolve a lizard into a person in the laboratory to make sure you're true because of the length of time involved. You can do small things, and you can watch maybe some viruses evolve and stuff like that, but you can't see the big stuff. So there are two things that have happened recently that are notable. One is the simulation theory. Simulation theory, for those very few of you who haven't heard it, is the idea that our reality as we experience it might be a computer-type simulation designed by a higher level species, and we think we're real, but we're just created, in a virtual reality kind of way, and we're just programs. Now, if we were just programs, that would certainly explain why we don't have free will, because free will wouldn't be a thing within a computer game. Now, it doesn't answer the question if we were created by someone else, who created them, but I don't need to answer that question because we're just talking about us. And the simulation theory simply says this, that it seems almost guaranteed that our current civilization, whether it's real or simulated, will create the ability to create other simulations that will act and they will act in every way as though they're real. And maybe internally, programmatically internally, they will also have something called feelings. That when you ask them this, you ask the simulation, do you feel something? The simulation will say yes. And when you poke it with something, I guess you'd have to poke it with some computer code, the simulation will go, ow. And so for all practical purposes, the simulation will be real to itself. It won't be real to the observer, but it will believe itself real, it will feel, it will act real, it will evolve. Well, if it's possible for us to do it, and we're right on the cusp of being able to do it, certainly in our lifetime we'll be able to do it, creating this fully simulated civilization, well, as soon as that simulated civilization is created, it will start evolving to the point where it too can create a simulation. So each simulation will create a new simulation, and it could happen at the speed of light, because computer program doesn't have to live by, the external world's rules of physics. So in all likelihood, since we know it will be possible to create such simulations, it's probably a billion to one or a trillion to one that we're an actual original species. Because for every original species, the number of simulations that it spawns might be somewhere between infinite and hundreds, billions, thousands. So purely on a mathematical basis, there's a reason that the smartest people in the world, Elon Musk, for example, and other smart people who will not say it publicly, trust me when I tell you that if I talk privately to the most brilliant people I know, almost all of them believe in the simulation theory. I know you don't want to hear that, but if you take the people who are not just in the top 1% of intelligence, but like crazy smart, and you talk to them privately, they'll tell you, yeah, simulation. It's the only one that makes sense, just because of the math. It's the math. Anyway, so if simulation theory is true, then the theory of evolution, as we understand it, actually doesn't even make sense. And if simulation theory is true, what you'd expect, because the computer programmers need to conserve resources, you don't have infinite resources. So one of the things you would do is that you would have your history on demand, meaning that we don't necessarily have a real history. It's just that when we need to have a history, it's created as needed, and sometimes two people will have different memories, And that's because two different histories were created and they didn't match up. And then, we negotiate, and I say, well, you must be crazier than me, so why don't you adopt my history? Oh, wait, here's an email that proves that my history was right. And then the other person says, oh, okay, I adopt your history. So it's entirely possible that we're, in fact, not possible, far more likely that we are a simulation. And if we are, our history and all the evolution stuff is a perception. It's not necessarily something that happened in the way a real world happens over time. But there was something even more interesting lately. So even if you don't believe the simulation hypothesis, something fascinating is happening within the scientific community that understands and works with evolution. So what I'm going to talk about now is what scientists who deal with evolution are looking at, not outside of science, within science now. And one of the things that they think they know, and this is mind-blowing, is that humans did not start from one source. And that something that was, an early human type may have started in several different, completely unrelated parts of the planet. And that these not quite human, but humanoid creatures eventually, populated and spread until they had contact with each other. And sometimes they could mate. Hold on. Are you telling me, yes I am, Scott, that the current people who are experts on evolution are saying that humanoids developed on completely different paths in completely different places, and still, when they got together, they could have a baby? You think? Now, the old thinking about Neanderthals and humans, and I might have this wrong, there's a good chance I have this wrong, is I think the older thinking was that whether you were a Denisovan or a Homo erectus or Neanderthal or whatever you were, that all of those came back to the same character, and that maybe they, after the original creature, they came from that and they spread out, but they were still close enough that they could have babies if they ran into each other. And that makes sense, right? We were one kind of creature, but we came a little bit different, but we never got so different we couldn't have babies. And that eventually that collapsed all of the different species into the winning species. That makes sense. But it turns out that we didn't all come from that one, Lucy or whatever was the proto-human. If we started in all different places, what are the odds that we evolved in a way that we can mate? All right? Now, this is preliminary, and everybody who will be my critic coming in here will say something which I will agree with. So I'm going to criticize myself first. People like me should not be talking about science. I'm not a scientist. I don't know enough. So when you're listening to anything I say, you should put that filter on it. It's like, well, I'd better check this with somebody who knows what they're doing. So I'm talking about it like a citizen, not a scientist. So I allow that I could be completely off base on this. I could be completely off base on this. But how do the evolutionists explain that these humanoids could be, growing up in completely different parts of the planet and still be close enough that they can have a baby? Keep in mind that dogs and cats look, kind of close in a weird, approximate way, but they can't have babies, right? It wasn't completely separate. Now, there is one theory that says that the aliens came down and they seeded various places and just to see what would happen. Maybe. Or maybe we're just a simulation. So the simulation theory explains everything. Because in the simulation theory, there is not an actual history which we're discovering and trying to figure it out, but rather it's being written as we discover some bones. Somebody digs in the ground and they find some bones and they say, okay, how does this fit in? Oh, it doesn't fit. Now I have to rewrite my history. Okay, now it fits. And then you find another fossil and you're like, oh, the way I rewrote it doesn't fit now. Now I got to rewrite it again. So simulation theory allows you to continually rewrite your history. Does it look like that's what's happening? It does to me.